Assalamu alaikum everyone, how are you guys doing? So one person that I've been seeing popping up a lot recently on YouTube is ironically Neil deGrasse Tyson. I have seen so many videos on YouTube with the thumbnail and the title being Neil deGrasse Tyson destroys religion. Neil deGrasse Tyson just debunks God. And I've seen these videos pop up so much recently, which is kind of weird. I kind of feel like Neil deGrasse Tyson's popularity kind of died down. Like not a lot of people actually like him. And in this video, I want to look at some of his arguments. The arguments I've seen repeated so many times in these videos on YouTube. I want to look at these arguments and show you guys why even though Neil deGrasse Tyson might have a PhD and might be super famous, we should not listen to him, especially when it comes to religion. I hope you guys like this video, and let's begin.
14, you did an interview, and they asked you, what do you think about God? And you said, I remain unconvinced by any claims anyone has ever made about the existence or the power of a divine force operating in the universe. Right?
Yeah, I would have said something like that for sure.
Right. And, since then...
by the way, just to be clear,
yeah.
What's probably missing from your extracted quote is the setup for that, which would be, is there a particular God you have in mind that you want me to comment on?
Huh. Okay. I missed that.
Because if you go online and in a Google search, you type gods worshipped by humans. There's a tally of all the gods ever worshipped by humans in the history of civilization. And it just goes screen after screen after screen after screen. So when you say, do you believe in God, which God? Is it Zeus? Is it Poseidon?
So in this first clip, Neil deGrasse Tyson is making the argument that when somebody comes up and tries to argue for the existence of God, his response, Tyson's response, is, well, which God? If you're going to argue to Tyson or any atheist basically that God exists, well, you have to specify which God you are talking about, prove that that is God, and then show why the other, let's say 17,999 gods, whatever was in the video, are not actually God. So you have a lot of steps prior to trying to convince Neil deGrasse Tyson that God exists. However, this is not a very intelligent argument. For starters, asking which God in a discussion or a debate about whether God exists is frankly besides the point. It does not matter about which God one is arguing about. It simply matters on whether a God exists. Those are two different questions. You can have a discussion on whether a God exists, and you can have another discussion on which God exists, but those should not be conflated. A way to better understand this: imagine a police officer coming to a town and telling the town that, guys, there is a serial killer on the loose. We have seen a bunch of dead bodies. People have cited there is a serial killer, and we want everybody to be cautious, not to go out at night, and so on and so forth. Now imagine if there's that Tyson skeptic, that atheist in the crowd. He raises his hands up and he goes like, well, chief, who is the serial killer? The chief says, well, we don't know who the serial killer is or which one of the town people is a serial killer yet. However, we do know that there is a serial killer in town, but we do not know who it is yet, so just be cautious. Then the atheist, the Tyson fanatic, says, well, I don't believe you. You must prove to me who is the serial killer. Out of all the 18,000 people in this town, prove which one of us is the serial killer, and then we'll see if the serial killer exists. Does that sound stupid? Well, because it is. It does not necessitate for somebody to provide the who in whether X exists. It only suffices to prove to somebody that X exists. So the chief can just come up with all the evidences, the photos, maybe the CRTV footage, all that stuff, and that is evidence that there is a serial killer. Whether or not, who is the serial killer, which one of the townspeople are the serial killer, that is completely besides the point. And many times, theists, while they do have one God in the back of their mind when they're talking to an atheist, they're first trying to convince somebody, an atheist, that the world needs a God, or that it is highly probable that there is a God. So they'll use many, the contingency argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the fine-tuning argument, and so on. Now, many of these arguments have been used by Christians, Muslims, and other believers throughout history, though the main purposes of those arguments is to prove that there is something, a necessary being. Then the next step is, okay, is there a God? Is that necessary being, let's say, a God? Or is the first cause of the universe a God? Or does the universe need a fine-tuner, and is that fine-tuner God? Once the theist gets the atheist to admit or see that there must be a God, then that goes into the third stage, well, which God is it? So Neil deGrasse Tyson, in his response, went to the third stage. Theists, Muslims, Christians alike, are in the first or second stage, not in the third stage. Another point that Neil deGrasse Tyson kind of slips in there is this 18,000 God remark. And I've heard this from atheists so many times. Well, there are thousands, 10,000, 100,000 gods in the universe. So how do I know which one is the right God? I have to look at each and every single God to determine that, yes, Allah is the right God, or Jesus is the right God. And in response to this, there are not really that many types of God. Actually, if you really think about it, there are only two types of God. There are the polytheistic gods and the monotheistic gods. And when you look at all 18,000, you don't have to go through each and every single one of them. If you find a contradiction, which there are many contradictions with the belief in a polytheistic God, then let's say there's 15,000 polytheistic gods, then we can wipe those off our list. We don't have to even look at those or consider those because those are contradictory, because those have problematic elements within the polytheistic understanding. Many people who argue for the necessary being, the first cause of the universe, the fine-tuner, all these, and so on and so forth, will argue for a monotheistic God. There cannot be two necessary beings. For instance, if you take the contingency argument, there has to be one. There cannot be two first cause of the universe because there needs to be one first cause of the universe. So the point being made here is that we can eliminate the polytheistic religions. And looking at other arguments as well, the polytheistic religions have their own issues. And when we look at the monotheistic religions, well, we just cut the list not even in half, by like 95%. There are really 3, maybe even 4 major monotheistic religions that we can look at. But generally, people look at Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. There's not 18,000 gods to choose from. Realistically speaking, there's only a handful of gods to choose from. And once you work within the parameters of logic, law of non-contradiction, you can just use the process of elimination. So once again, this argument falls flat, that this is literally just diverging the question to somewhere else, saying which God has no relevancy in another situation. It simply falls flat, and there are not as many gods to choose from as Tyson is making it. So this first argument that many people have posted online and showing how Neil deGrasse Tyson debunks religion or God simply falls flat.
I have no problems if, as we probe the origins of things, we bump up into the bearded man. If that shows up, we're good to go. Okay? Not a problem. There's just no evidence of it. And this is why religions are called faiths, collectively. Because you believe something in the absence of evidence. That's what it is. That's why it's called faith. Otherwise, we would call all religions evidence.
In the second clip, Neil deGrasse Tyson is saying that I'm not against believing in God. However, there's been no evidence to show that God exists. If there's no evidence, then why would I believe something based on faith alone? Just so we can understand, what is evidence? In the field of epistemology, the field of philosophy of how we get knowledge, what are the roads to getting knowledge? Evidence simply means anything that increases the believability of X, of something else, of something that you are arguing for. For instance, let's say you're up in your room and all of a sudden you hear your front door open, and then you hear the front door close and you hear accompanying footsteps. For you, that is strong evidence that somebody entered your house, that somebody came inside, closed the door, and started walking around. Hopefully not a robber. That is evidence to a probable conclusion. It raises the believability that your conclusion that somebody entered the house is correct. And you can because you provide these evidence. Well, the door opened when it was closed. It closed again, and you hear footsteps. All of those increase the believability that somebody entered your house. That's how evidence works. Whether or not that conclusion is correct is a different question. However, there is evidence to support that. Understanding that there are many things that are considered evidence for people, and what are considered evidence for people who do epistemology, who study philosophy. For instance, testimony. Testimony is considered evidence. If, for instance, one person were to leave a building running and saying, hey, watch out, there's a fire in the building, you may or may not believe them. However, let's say if 15 people came out of the same building saying, there's a fire, do not go in, you will most likely believe them. This in Islam is called a mutawatir. When there are so many people who say the same claim, who saw the fire or heard the fire, and they're repeating the exact same thing, that there is a fire, well, there's no reason for us to doubt that because there's so much evidence that there is actually a fire. Logical arguments are also evidence. For instance, the conclusion Socrates is mortal is supported by the two premises prior to it. All men are mortal, Socrates is a man. Those are two evidence, those premises are evidence for the conclusion that therefore Socrates is mortal. Logical deductive arguments are considered evidence. They lead to they increase the probability of the conclusion. Especially for deductive arguments, if the premises are true and they lead to the conclusion, then the conclusion by necessity is true in all cases. Now, what does this have to do with God? Well, if we take evidence as most epistemologists would understand it to be, those dealing in that field of philosophy, and how even we understand it, and if you agree with everything I simply said before, then there is a boatload of evidence for the existence of God. Just to name the few: the contingency argument, the Kalam cosmological argument, the ontological argument, the modal ontological argument, the modal argument. There is the first cause argument. There is the fine-tuning argument. There are testimonial evidence as well that people have claimed that they had an inspiration from God. Now, whether or not you find these convincing is a different discussion. If Tyson says, hey, I don't find any of the evidence for God's existence to be convincing, well, I would be making a different point right now. He is saying that there is no evidence for God's existence. Frankly speaking, this is not true. No actual philosopher worth his degree, wherever he got it from, Graham Oppy, even all these other atheist philosophers, Michael Huemer, they will not agree with the claim made by Neil deGrasse Tyson. It is simply not true to say that there is no evidence for God's existence. There is evidence for God's existence. There is a lot of evidence for God's existence. Frankly speaking, there's a lot of good evidence for God's existence, and many atheists will agree that those are good evidence for God's existence. However, I feel like what Tyson means by evidence, he means scientific evidence rather than just the evidence that I discussed, what I mean by evidence, what philosophers mean by evidence. Meaning, for Tyson, what is considered evidence is anything that is done through the scientific process. However, that's problematic. First off, that is a philosophical belief, scientism. You uphold a philosophical belief that the only way to truth is through science. However, that principle in and of itself is not proven through science, so it's kind of contradictory in and of itself, but we'll ignore that part. There are many things that all scientists believe in, nearly all humans believe in, and it's a principles of science, that without those principles, science cannot be done, and which are not even proven through the scientific process. For instance, the law of non-contradiction. There's no scientific paper showing that contradictions cannot exist. However, science is built. One of the pillars of science is the law of non-contradictions. Things cannot contradict. Because if the universe could contradict, there's contradictions occurring everywhere with the laws of nature, then all of science should be just thrown in the trash bin. There's no point. One of the principles of science is that the world has no contradictions, and we work within the laws of nature, which are strong and have no contradictions. Another principle is that there's an external world, that we are living in a world. We're not just brains in a vat. Can you prove to me scientifically that we are not brains in the vat? Well, and people are not really delving deep into this because we take it on a first principle basis. That yes, we have an external world, that there is an external world, or that our memories are valid. If we just eliminate all of these because there is no scientific proof, then we fall into many problems. So even the philosophical position that Tyson upholds, which is not in and of itself proven by science, but there are so many pillars of science that there's no evidence of. So therefore, this argument that there's no evidence simply once again falls flat and really shows Neil deGrasse Tyson's ignorance.
Talking one time, and a lady said to me, I said, I believe God created heaven and earth. She said, well, scientifically, it's been proven that it came from a cosmic dust that spun into a ball of gas and it cooled off. I said, okay, let me ask you something. Where did cosmic dust come from? And then she said, it's part of the universe. I said, where did the universe come from? She says, part of the galaxy. I said, where did the galaxy come from? I'm just trying to get to where something formed something.
We can do that. We say, where did dust come from? It came from the cores of stars. And where did that come from? And then ultimately we get to the Big Bang. Then you say, well, where did the Big Bang come from? And I said, I have no idea. It is a frontier of science. We've got top people working on it. You want to put God there? I don't have a problem with that. But why won't you allow me to ask you, where did God come from?
So the next argument that Neil deGrasse Tyson makes against religion is, where did God come from? Essentially, many times theists will argue that, well, where did we come from? Then we give a question, we give an answer based on the natural world. Then it's like, well, where did the world come from? Well, the universe, or the galaxy. Where did the galaxy from? The universe. Where did the universe come from? The particles. Where did the particles come from? Essentially arguing that there must be a first cause. There must be something that was the first thing. We cannot go infinitely to the past. So we have to go essentially back to a first cause, which for many theists, that is God. Neil deGrasse Tyson's response is, well, where did God come from? And everyone in the audience is like, oh my God, I can't even give this answer. Is this the best that, is this really what atheists are propping up on YouTube? This guy, these arguments? I'm really let down, to be honest. This is an idiotic question. Many reasons. For many people, an infinite regress to the past is impossible. The famous sniper analogy by Hamza's Den is, imagine if you are a sniper and you're going to shoot your target. But in order for you to shoot that target, you need to get permission from your boss. And for that boss to allow you to shoot that target, he has to get permission from his boss. And then that boss from his boss. Imagine if that set goes back forever. If that set goes back forever, will the shooter be able to shoot his target? Well, no, there's an infinite regress going to the back of bosses asking their boss, who's asking their bosses infinitely. So he will never be able to shoot his target. So essentially what the theists are trying to argue is there needs to be a stopping point, a beginning. There needs to be something, a start of everything. For theists, that is God. And by definition, God is infinite. By definition, God is the necessary being, meaning that there's nothing explaining God, that there is nothing that God is dependent upon for his existence. Now, many theists will uphold this. They might even admit, yes, there cannot be an infinite regress to the past. Or they might grant that there is infinite regress, but they still believe that there is something necessary. I.e., there cannot be, even if infinity did exist, there needs to be one thing that is not contingent, not could fail to exist, or not that it is dependent on something else. a necessary existence. Many atheists will agree on this point. Graham Oppy, an atheist, agrees with this point. There needs to be something necessary to explain the world, even if there's an infinite regress. Whatever that thing is, by definition, it does not have something that caused it. By definition, because it would not be the necessary being. For many atheists, that could be the laws of nature, the laws of non-contradiction, maybe the Big Bang, whatever the case may be. There needs to be a necessary existence. And for theists, that necessary existence is God. Once again, we have reasons why we believe that that necessary existence is God. However, once again, God, by definition, does not have a beginning, like any necessary existence that an atheist would argue for, by definition, cannot have a beginning. So the point being made here is that theists, even atheists alike, will argue for a necessary existence. And for Neil deGrasse Tyson to say, well, who created God, with that kind of like, with him trying to be smart and intellectual, is against all of philosophy of religion. It's against all of the papers and arguments atheists and theists alike are trying to explain, which is a necessary existence. So once again, this just proves that Neil deGrasse Tyson does not really know philosophy that much, nor does he know religion.
Is there a God then, Neil deGrasse Tyson? I'll be about to have breaking news.
I don't know.
Is there a God?
Okay, so what I will tell you is that there are a lot of unknowns in the universe, but just because there are unknowns does not mean there's a deity in the unknown. The track record of people saying God is behind this, and then you add a little science to it and you find out, no, we can completely explain it and control it, then the history of that exercise is so rich with science discovering the unknowns that were previously ascribed to deity, like lightning bolts and weather systems. There was Poseidon, there was Zeus, just look at the history of this. I'm not given reason to say we're going to find something, God is going to be at the center of that, and there'll be no science to apply.
Now, in this final clip I want to share with you guys, Neil deGrasse Tyson claims that theists are making the God of the gaps argument when they're trying to convince non-theists God exists or to justify their own beliefs. Now, the God of the gaps is essentially there is something unexplained in the natural world. And theists, this is the claim that Tyson is making, will just stick in God and say, hey, see, that proves that God exists, or that is only from God. He gives the example of lightning. Back in the day, people saw lightning and just said, oh, that is the wrath of God. However, through modern science, we have seen that there's a natural process and reason for why lightning occurs. And the point that he's trying to make here is that there's 2 points he's trying to make here. One, that theists are using the God of the gaps argument when science ends up proving the natural reason for everything to exist. Two, that there's a divide. You either believe in science or you believe in religion. Let's deal with the first part, which is the God of the gaps argument. Theists don't make the argument that there is something that occurs in the natural world that could have an explanation, and then just inserting God for that explanation. What theists do argue is that there is something in the universe that cannot be explained through natural processes, that it is impossible for science or the natural world to explain what exists in this natural world. A clear-cut case is consciousness. We humans are made up of nonsense parts. Our skin, even the parts that make up the brain, all of our bodies are made up of nonsense parts. Parts that cannot in and of themselves sense the outside world or sense pain or pleasure or have these inner workings within us. However, yet we humans do have sense ability. We have the ability to sense things. This is a problem that many atheists deal with. Even atheist philosophers like Graham Oppy sometimes concedes with the theists that this does point towards and helps the belief in the existence of God. David Chalmers himself, an atheist philosopher, argues that we cannot explain consciousness through this material, naturalistic world. It is simply speaking impossible. Some people might say, Well, when we look at the brain, we can see different portions lighting up, but that it does not explain how, even if though there are different portions lighting up, how a person can have the ability to think, how the person can have the ability to feel. It still does not explain that process. But what about how this world, based on modal logic, based on probability, how is it that this world exists? Look at the fine-tuning argument. If the Earth was just a tad millimeter closer to the sun, we'd all burn up. If it was a tad millimeter farther away from the sun, we would freeze up. This would raise the probability that a God exists, that the likelihood of all of this world, this universe being designed for us is 1,000,000,001 chance. So it just raised the probability for theists that a God exists. Those are not the equivalent of what Tyson says, like lightning. Those are things that cannot be explained through the material, natural world. There needs to be something outside this world to explain those processes, those facts of the universe. And that is what theists are arguing for. Not this God of the gaps argument that Tyson is strawmanning the theist is making, but in actuality, they are showing something that cannot be explained through the natural materials world, that even atheists can agree on that, and showing how that can lead to the believability of God. The second portion of this critique from Neil deGrasse Tyson is this dichotomy, that you either believe in science or you believe in God. But this is strictly speaking not true. For starters, science can never prove or disprove God. Science only deals with the natural world. Science does not deal with the non-natural world. God is not in this natural world, therefore science can never prove or disprove God. So there's no issue for us Muslims, for instance, or religious people to believe in science. In fact, the founder of the scientific way, the inductive argument, process of science, the one that Neil deGrasse Tyson uses himself and praises so much, is founded by a Muslim. Ibn al-Haytham is the founder of the scientific process. Without him, Tyson has no foot to stand on. He has nothing to stand on. The Muslim was the one who found science and developed the scientific method and categorized it and canonized it. And his reasoning was, when he looked at the world, he was just so enamored at the beauty of what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, what God did, that he wanted to investigate it more to increase his belief and faith in a God, in Allah. He developed science not despite or in anger or against the belief in God, but because of his love of God. So we Muslims, at least Muslims, have no issue with science. In fact, Ibn al-Haytham, a Muslim, developed and canonized the scientific method. This dichotomy of science and religion is simply old of what the new atheists like Richard Dawkins and Sam Harris and all these other washed up atheists have said, like Christopher Hitchens, for so many years. It is simply speaking not true, and actually Muslims were the one who developed the scientific method. The question is, why did I make this video? Why did I go about debunking Tyson's arguments? Well, for starters, many times people see somebody who has a PhD, who has a position of power, who is wealthy, who is in the West, and when he says something, without actually thinking about it, they are more prone to believe in what that person is saying. I have seen so many people who go like, Tyson said this, oh my God, my faith is shaken. However, once they actually look at the argument, they go like, oh, well, that's actually not that smart. And that's the point I'm trying to show in this video, that just because Neil deGrasse Tyson has a PhD in a field in science does not mean he has the right to discuss religion. We see those people who are coming out of Oxford, Cambridge, Harvard, Stanford, Yale, and they wear a suit and tie and they talk so sophisticated and they're developing these arguments against God, and we may feel like, oh, I'm being hurt, like this is affecting me. However, you just have to look at the argument and see that it is super weak. Yet many atheists, when the argument comes up to them saying, look how weak that argument is, they won't believe because saying, well, yeah, but look at this guy. He has a PhD. What's your degree? Look at this guy. He went to Cambridge, Oxford, and Yale, and you went where? Medina, for instance. And surprisingly, this is what the Quran states as well. In Surah Al-Baqarah, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states, وَإِذَا قِيلَ لَهُمُ اتَّبِعُوا مَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ قَالُوا بَلْ نَتَّبِعُ مَا أَلْفَيْنَا عَلَيْهِ آبَاءَنَا أَوَلَوْ كَانَ آبَاؤُهُمْ لَا يَعْقِلُونَ شَيْئًا وَلَا يَهْتَدُونَ. When it is said to them, follow what Allah has revealed, they reply, no, we only follow what we found our forefathers practicing. Would they still do so even if their forefathers had absolutely no understanding or guidance? Many atheists will point to Richard Dawkins, Neil deGrasse Tyson, all these people with these PhDs in science and graduating from those top universities and say, we are just following what they are saying because they're at the top. They're the smartest. Exactly what the Quran is saying. Even though the Quran is saying our forefathers, it's the same process. That the non-Muslims are not looking at the arguments themselves, but they are looking at the person giving the argument. None of these arguments from Neil deGrasse Tyson or even Richard Dawkins are good arguments. Yet, people follow them or fall victim to them simply because of the doctor title that is given to Neil deGrasse Tyson. Simply because he speaks really good English. Simply because he is in the West and he's so popular. The exact same thing as it is said in the Quran. Then the second part of the verse, when it says, even if they had no guidance, is exactly what is shown by Neil deGrasse Tyson. Tyson has no knowledge in philosophy, religion, or any of these matters. Even though he has no guidance and he has no knowledge of those matters, people will still follow Tyson because they say, I'm just following him, he has a PhD. The point I'm making here is follow the arguments. Once you look at the arguments logically, you will see that these atheists like Neil deGrasse Tyson are presenting super weak arguments. Consider the arguments from both sides rather than looking at the individual. And from this video, we have seen the individual of Neil deGrasse Tyson, when it comes to arguments, philosophical discussions, simply has no idea what he's talking about. I hope you guys enjoyed this video, and I hope to see you guys next time, and Assalamu alaikum.